This is the lecture on bizarre and far-out subject matter. I'll begin by discussing the epistemological issues. Krishna consciousness is, of course, understood by the process of disciplic succession, absolute knowledge descending from Krishna through the Guru Parampara. So that's the basic way to understand transcendental knowledge. You have to obtain the knowledge from a higher source. It is not possible to obtain that knowledge directly through the use of our ordinary senses. However, as Judakarma pointed out in the class he gave, many people today are a bit bewildered when it comes to accepting transcendental knowledge by disciplic succession. And they're oriented towards accepting knowledge on the basis of sense perception or pratyaksha and hypothesis, anumana. Actually, however, most people today accept knowledge on the basis of shabda. Shabda means sound vibration. And the question is, of course, who is speaking? The natural tendency in human beings is to accept knowledge on the basis of what is said by some authorities. And people tend to do that today also. But then the question comes of who the authorities are. Who should one accept as authorities? What speech can be regarded as valid or worthy of being listened to? So in the scientific field also, we find the same situation. People accept knowledge on the basis of what someone else has said, and this is connected with the authority of that person. For example, one may hear that a learned scholar or scientist has come to such and such conclusion. In that case, it is deemed to be inadvisable to disagree with that conclusion, because after all, the learned professor or scientist has concluded this, therefore we should accept that. How can we go against it? He has made such great studies, he is learned, he has a position, let's say in a university, so therefore one should go along with his opinion. It can certainly not be challenged. So this is a very natural way of thinking. Actually, this is quite natural for human beings to think this way. But then the question comes as to who the authority is. Another point concerning Shabda is that in the whole domain of science, knowledge is basically transmitted on the basis of communication. A given person may make an observation or perform an experiment, but not everybody can make that observation or perform that experiment. It's simply not possible. How many people have tried to reproduce all the major experiments on which physics or chemistry is based? Nobody can do that. You could spend your lifetime trying to do all those experiments. So, besides, many of them require all kinds of material facilities, a laboratory with all kinds of equipment, which is very expensive, and so forth. So, in science, also a great deal of material, practically everything that a given scientist believes or accepts is based on hearing from other people within the scientific community. Now, there's a social process within science which determines who you should hear from and who you shouldn't hear from. Certain people and certain categories of statement are regarded as acceptable. You can hear those, and it's quite proper to take those very seriously as truth. In fact, it would be considered improper to not take them as truth. But then there are other categories of subject matter and also other groups of people for which it is not acceptable to regard what they say as truth. One should rather reject what they say as nonsense. And this is based on the social processes within science. Within the scientific community, you learn to identify those who are acceptable as disseminators of truth and those who should be rejected. This is what happens. And you do this without investigating the details lying behind people's statements, because first of all, you don't have time to investigate all those details. And you couldn't do it even if you tried, because you'd have to go to the different places or perform the different experiments and so forth. Now, in science, there are two kinds of sensory knowledge that people have. One is knowledge based on experiments that you can perform with some equipment in a laboratory. And the other is based on observation of phenomena that happen according to their own rules, so that you can't make those phenomena happen, but you just have to observe them as they come up. An example of the latter would be, say, meteorology, the study of weather. You can't make the weather happen. So if you want to study the weather, you have to wait for different weather phenomena to take place. For example, recently there were 2 hurricanes with 160-mile-an-hour winds. So these don't happen every day. And so if you want to study such a hurricane, you have to learn that such a hurricane is about to hit the coast of Florida, let's say, and then you go there in order to study it. Otherwise, you just have to take other people's word for it. So that's a preliminary on evidence. So what we're doing here is proposing that the basic structure of reality that is described in the Vedic literature is actually true. This is part and parcel of the whole philosophy of Krishna consciousness. For Krishna consciousness to be valid, then what is contained in the Vedic literature must be true. So the Vedic literature gives a complete description of the world. It talks about transcendental subject matter, and it also talks about the material world and how different things work in the domain of material energy. So the Vedic literature covers all of reality, and it makes very remarkable statements about reality. So according to the disciplic succession, the Vedic literature is actually giving a true account of reality. And if you look, you see that everything in the Vedic account of reality ties together. It's not that you can neatly just leave out a certain part and still have a complete system, but everything is required. So the situation is that today people are largely basing their idea of reality on modern science. So in modern science, based on sense perception and transmission of information through the social network, a certain picture of reality is built up, and that is accepted as factual. So the scientists are going to reject, scientists and people who are strongly influenced by modern science will tend to reject the process of acceptance of knowledge by disciplic succession, both because the process is foreign to them and because the specific knowledge conveyed by disciplic succession seems quite strange to them. In the Vedic literature, you have the whole idea of the soul, the subtle body, transmigration of the soul, mystic powers, demigods, and all kinds of very remarkable things, which, according to the modern scientific view, would be regarded as unreal. So that is the basic situation. You have a conflict between the Vedic picture and the picture that you find in modern science. Now, our thesis is that if you take the Vedic picture and just look at that as a hypothesis for scientific consideration, never mind whether it's absolute or not, absolutely true or not, but just consider that as a hypothetical description of the world, one can ask how well that actually agrees with sense perception, with observations that people make in the world. And our thesis is that actually the Vedic picture agrees with reality much better than the modern scientific picture. The modern scientific picture works very well for certain categories of evidence. But as you were hearing in the lecture Dhruta Karma gave earlier on, scientists themselves reject very large categories of evidence. They're not treating all of the evidence equally. So this is the general thesis we have. If you want to apply the scientific approach, and if you look at all of the evidence dispassionately, that is, without applying different standards to different types of evidence, you'll see that, first of all, the basic theoretical structure of modern science does not agree so well with the evidence that's available. And secondly, that this evidence does agree quite well with the Vedic picture. So one may ask, well, what does this prove? Ultimately, this doesn't prove anything because within science you never have proof. In empirical studies, there's never such a thing as proof, because all evidence ultimately is based on what people report. This gets back to the point I made about Shabda. Someone may perform an experiment, he may know what happened, but other people later on only hear his report of what happened. Someone may make an observation of a phenomenon, and he may know what he saw, but other people only know what he said, and still other people only know what somebody said that he said. And that's inevitably the way it has to be, unless some of us may have omniscience, so that we can see all and hear all, and so forth. So it's a question of knowledge transmitted through human communication. So sensory knowledge, which is then converted into verbal or written descriptions and transmitted through human society, inevitably is going to be imperfect. Our idea of absolute knowledge being transmitted by disciplic succession assumes that there are persons that are essentially superhuman in their characteristics who are transmitting the knowledge, namely avatars of Krishna and acharyas who are pure devotees, and so on and so forth. But when one is dealing with ordinary human beings transmitting information, inevitably the process is imperfect. But the scientific process is also imperfect. So one piece of imperfect evidence can be placed side by side with another piece of imperfect evidence, and if the two happen to cancel one another out, then at least that eliminates the one piece of imperfect evidence. In other words, if you contrast with the modern scientific picture other sense data conveyed through human reports, and those two things cancel out, then the cancellation is done. You can conclude that the scientific theory is in need of revision and extension. On the positive side, if a large body of material happens to support the Vedic picture, that is some evidence in favor of the Vedic picture. It's a reason for possibly having faith in the absolute process of disciplic succession and so forth. At least it's a motive for considering that that might be a serious option to think about. So that's the introduction concerning epistemology, to show what is really going on in this kind of discussion. So to go into the specific topic I wanted to talk about today, what I'm going to talk about is a basic property of the Vedic picture of reality, which is very different from the modern scientific picture. And that is that in the modern scientific picture of reality, what we see either directly with our senses or with reasonably powerful instruments would correspond to the total reality, pretty much. In other words, the idea is that everything that goes on takes place within three-dimensional space, or four-dimensional space-time, if you like, the theory of relativity. Within this three-dimensional framework, there are atoms, molecules, subatomic particles, and so on. You can't see these directly, but you can detect them with different kinds of equipment, electron microscopes, and so on and so forth. Helium bubble chambers for subatomic particles and so forth. And basically they make up gross matter which we directly see, and that's reality. That's what reality is made of. And this reality extends through space for very great distances. And mostly if you get beyond the Earth and the solar system, you have a near vacuum with just a few little atoms floating through it and photons of radiation, and that's about it. And stars, galaxies, and so forth. That's reality. According to the Vedic picture, there are many different levels of reality. And what we see with these eyes is extremely limited. So, to illustrate the idea of many different levels of reality, this is described, by the way, in the Sankhya philosophy section, for example, in the 3rd canto of the Śrīmad Bhagavatam. But to illustrate this idea, one can use a pond with ripples on the surface of the water as an example. You can imagine, just to elaborate the example, a long time ago, a fellow wrote a book called Flatland, a fellow named Abbott, in fact. It was a political satire about a two-dimensional world with two-dimensional people who interacted two-dimensionally, and they engaged in political activities similar to what was going on in England at the time that the thing was written. And in this way, he was making different comments politically. But so imagine a two-dimensional world in which there are two-dimensional people with two-dimensional bodies, and they're moving around and doing things, saying hello to one another and so forth. So now imagine that their bodies are made of ripples on the surface of water. Ripples can form many different patterns. So imagine a pattern of ripples on water that looks like somebody's body. So real water ripples won't really do for this, because if you did have a pattern of ripples that looked like a person's body on the surface of a pond, they would simply disperse in all directions and that body would be finished immediately. That's because of the nature of water. But there are wave equations in which ripples don't behave that way. They have more cohesion, like the equations of quantum mechanics, the Schrödinger equation, and so forth. So we can imagine these bodies, which are just ripple patterns moving about. They interact with one another by sending ripples back and forth from one to the other, just like we're interacting by sending sound waves back and forth, and also light waves. And those are ripples of the sort. They're vibrational patterns. So you hear me because I'm vibrating my vocal cords, and that makes sound, and that goes to your ear and vibrates your ear, and so on. So these ripple pattern people in this two-dimensional world are communicating with one another, we can imagine. So to them, that world of ripple patterns is the total reality, and that's all they know. In particular, they don't know that this is a pond on which they're situated. They're not aware of that at all, because they're just the ripple patterns on the surface. Now imagine that somebody throws a pebble into the pond. So the pebble goes kerplunk, and suddenly these ripples appear, and to the beings in this ripple pattern world, these ripples appeared out of nowhere. It's a miracle. What happened? Something appeared literally out of nowhere. So that's a fairly crude example. But now let's take a more sophisticated example. Suppose you made a gadget with little propellers or something like that, or vibrators or something, so that it would vibrate just beneath the surface of the water. And it had many of these little vibrators arranged in a pattern. So you push the button and this thing turns on, and as soon as it does so and begins vibrating, immediately on the surface of the water, a certain pattern of ripples will form. To make it really elaborate, let's say this is the body of one of these beings. So just by pushing the button, suddenly the little buzzers move, a ripple pattern appears, and that's the body of one of these beings. So now a new being is there. So to the other beings, this being has suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And this is shocking. What's going on? He appeared out of nowhere, and then he moves around and does things. And it'll be even more interesting now if you have a negative vibrator. This vibrator counteracts the vibrations that the first vibrator made and subtracts out those waves. So you turn on the switch for that one after positioning it properly under that ripple pattern, and now it erases that pattern of waves from the surface. So that being disappeared. So he was there, he moved around, and he did things, and then suddenly he was gone. So, from the point of view of the ripple people, this is very amazing. In fact, it's fantastic. It's practically unbelievable. Those of them who are superstitious will speak about it must have been done by God, and so forth. Well, actually, in the model I'm proposing, in a way it was. But indirectly, if you look at the total picture we have here, you have the pond and you have the gadget underneath, then you see that nothing miraculous is happening. The reason that particular pattern of ripples formed there is that this gadget was turned on that made the pattern. So this is an analogy to the action of mind on ether. I won't go through the whole Sankhya philosophy in detail, but basically you have from the energy of Mahavishnu, you have the pradhan, under the action of the time factor injected by Mahavishnu with his glance, the pradhan differentiates and the modes of nature appear, false ego appears, different elements differentiate out. One of these elements is ether. Ether is basically space. But space is not just emptiness. One way to think about space is that it's a vacuum. It's the absence of things. But in this concept of space, space is actually a plenum. It's full. Plenum just means full. It's like plenary portion of Vishnu. So, in addition to ether, there's mind. And it's described in the Bhagavatam, in the 3rd canto, that ether is the field of activities for the mind, and the mind can generate forms within the ether. So these forms within the ether can become manifest in terms of gross matter, because it's described that the gross material elements of air, fire, water, and earth are transformations of ether. And this is described in detail in the Bhagavatam. It's fairly complex because the tanmatras and the senses and so forth are all involved in this. But basically, by transformations of ether, gross matter can be produced. And mind can transform ether. This means that mind, in principle, could produce gross matter. Not only that, it could produce gross matter in particular forms. And it could erase those forms. This is potentially there. And according to the Vedic literature, the universe is populated with many different grades of living beings. In particular, the demigods have the power to manipulate the mind on such a level that they could generate forms, erase forms, and so forth. And in the Vedic literature, we see many different examples of this. Not only the demigods can do that, but we see examples indicating that asuras can do that. I know when the first time I came to a Hare Krishna temple, which was in Henry Street in New York City, I walked into the temple, and very quickly I was given a Krishna book to read. So I took that, went over, sat down, started reading, and immediately I read regular verbs about shape-changing demons. Different demons assumed different animal forms, and they would go to attack Krishna, and then he would dispatch them very quickly. So this was somewhat shocking. I was thinking, what is this? I mean, is this what these people believe? I mean, really? But actually, yes, that's what they believe, all right. But it's not actually such a remarkable thing. From the point of view of modern science, this is a very remarkable thing. In fact, there's no basis for believing such a thing at all. Because, as I was saying, in the picture of the world in modern science, the complete reality is basically there in front of us. And there's no potentiality within that reality to create forms apparently out of nowhere. But in the Vedic scheme of things, mind, by manipulating ether, could generate forms of any desired nature. For example, Kardama Muni did that. We're reading in the Bhagavatam recently that he generated a flying palace. And he himself was astonished by it. because actually the ideas within our mind are not entirely generated by us. We get our ideas from different sources. Actually, there's so many different things involved in the source of our ideas. Karma and the supersoul and so many different factors. So Kardama Muni had this idea which manifested within his mind, and immediately a flying palace was created. So this brings us to the subject of today's talk, namely UFO phenomenon. That and paranormal phenomenon. So what I'm going to discuss is examples of empirical evidence which corroborate this basic aspect of the Vedic picture of reality. In particular, the idea that forms can be generated from a subtle level, on the level of mind and so forth, and assume gross manifestation. And these forms in turn can then be erased also in the same way. It turns out that there's a lot of empirical evidence that tends to corroborate this. I was talking about the UFO phenomenon last time, and this time I was going to start out with a related subject which comes up. I'll assume a certain amount of knowledge from the previous class. But what I was going to begin with is the idea of out-of-body experiences. I'm going to tie that in with the whole UFO phenomenon. So here is an example of an out-of-body experience that somebody reported. This was a patient of this doctor named Michael Sabum, who's a cardiologist. So the man was resuscitated from a heart attack. And after recovering, he described the following experience. He said that he experienced, I was walking across this wooden bridge over this running stream of water, and on the opposite side I was looking, and there was Christ, and he was standing with a very white robe. He had jet black hair and a very short black beard. His teeth were extremely white, and his eyes were blue, very blue. He looked different from any picture I had seen before. My real focus was on the white robe, and if I could prove it to myself that this was really Christ. And during all this time, the knowledge, the universal knowledge opened up to me, and I wanted to capture all of this so that when I was able, I could let people know what was really around them. The only trouble was that I was unable to bring any of it back. So this is the man's account. These accounts are quite common. Sometimes they're called near-death experiences because they often happen when a person, say, has a heart attack or is hit by a car, comes close to death. Various severe medical conditions can bring this on, conditions that disrupt the functioning of the body or of the brain. Sometimes it happens spontaneously. The last time I talked about this, afterwards, a man who was listening described to me his whole experience, which was very similar to this, which just happened in his living room one evening. He was just sitting on the sofa, I think, and suddenly he went out of his body, he said, went flying down this tunnel of light and had this kind of experience. And then he described coming back into his body. It was as though he was falling, and he landed in his body with an abrupt jolt. But he didn't have a heart attack or anything like that, nor any obvious medical condition. So this is an example. Now, an experience like this, you can say, well, what's happening here? First of all, is the man really seeing Jesus Christ? First point is he wasn't sure himself if that's who he was seeing. He thought maybe that is who it was, but he was doubtful. And it didn't look like any picture he'd seen of Jesus Christ. So basically he saw this being who communicated somehow this knowledge to him on a mental level. So you can say, well, perhaps this is just a hallucination. Now ultimately, you can never rule out the hypothesis of hallucination for these things. Of course, ultimately there's the question of what a hallucination is anyway. There's a lot to be known about hallucinations. One way to look at it is that there are different categories of visions that people see. One category of vision is what I'm seeing right now. How do I know this isn't a hallucination? Alcoholic stupor can produce many different kinds of vision, but these tend to be incoherent. They don't hold together. They swirl about and shift from one to the other very quickly. So that's certainly low quality vision. So the kind of vision this fellow had is fairly frequently reported. The interesting thing is, first of all, I'd like to say something to support the serious nature of the out-of-body experiences, and that is that sometimes people also see what is going on in the room where they left their body. Let's say it's a hospital room and the doctor is resuscitating them from a heart attack. So they see what the doctors are doing. And this Sabam did a whole study in which he cross-examined the witnesses, looked at their medical records, and he found that people who had these experiences were in some cases able to give very accurate accounts of exactly what the doctors did while their mind was supposedly non-functional because no blood was being supplied to the brain because the heart was stopped. For example, this fellow said, one of these people Dr. Sabam described as follows. He said, his description is extremely accurate in portraying the appearance of both the technique of cardiopulmonary resuscitation and the proper sequence in which this technique is performed, i.e. chest thump, external cardiac massage, airway insertion, administration of medications, and defibrillation. So there are a lot of details. It's not a simple process, and this fellow got the details right. But he was not at all knowledgeable about medicine. The guy was some kind of construction worker or truck driver or something like that. In any case, that's a whole subject. But we have these examples in which people see these beings. So now I'm going to shift to the topic of UFOs. Experiences that people have with UFOs have a lot in common with out-of-body experiences. And many things that are frequently reported seem to be more consistent with the idea that it's an out-of-body experience than with the idea that it happened physically to the person. For example, people will report that these beings came, picked them up, and carried them through a wall up into the air and into a UFO. There are lots of reports like this. And by the way, the people who make the reports, as I mentioned the last time, have at least in some cases been analyzed psychologically and found to be perfectly normal people, not psychotic or anything like that. What's going on? One explanation would be that they had an out-of-body experience. This would explain how it is that they went through the wall and so forth. People who have out-of-body experiences do relate that kind of thing. They'll say they did go through the wall. For example, a person may be in one room and he wonders what's in the next room, and he just goes through the wall and he sees what's in the next room in these out-of-body experiences. So the UFO accounts are similar to that. There are cases where a person reports a UFO experience after having a classical out-of-body experience. There's the case of a man in England who was in the dentist's chair. The dentist was administering, I guess, nitrous oxide or something in preparation for extracting teeth, and his patient apparently died on him, just died in the chair. And the dentist was quite disturbed. He was doing cardiac massage, thumping the guy's chest, and so forth. And the man experienced that a white-robed figure came floating down through the ceiling, took a hold of his arm, floated him up through the ceiling into a UFO, and took him on a tour of the UFO. And then it became a typical UFO experience. People often report being taken on a tour of the ship and being shown the propulsion system and told incomprehensible things that actually don't make sense at all, and then taken back. So that's what happened with him. Then the man said, when you go back to the white-robed man, said, well, when you try to go back you'll be stopped by these ugly beings who will try to interfere with you, but just force your way through and you'll get back to your body. So, according to his experience, he did that, and these beings tried to stop him, but he got through, and then he felt himself falling into his body, which was on the dentist's chair. That's a commonly reported experience. You fall into your body abruptly. And then he woke up, and the dentist was greatly relieved. So that happens. So you could say, well, looks like these could be out-of-body experiences. Here's another example. A woman was lying on the couch reading, well, it was the Bible, in her house trailer. She said, then she had this experience. She says, I see myself standing and I see myself lying on the couch. The being had put a small box or something on the couch first, and then I saw myself appear there. I see myself standing up and turning toward the being. Then I turn toward the couch and reach down and touch myself, and my hand goes right through me, she says. So she's reporting an experience in which this being was there, did something with this box. She has an out-of-body experience, turns around, sees her body there, reaches through her body with her hand. The being, however, is exactly, for those of you who know of these things, one of the gray beings involved in the UFO abductions. So this took place entirely in an out-of-body state. And then she went through some experience with the UFO and so forth. Or there are many examples of this. Yeah, in the disembodied state, she went into the UFO. So there are many cases in which people seem bewildered by this. Like in another case, there's an interview going on. This Emily says, not in the car, but I am in the car. It's silly. The guy says, McCall, don't worry about it. Just tell me what's going on. Emily, that's silly. You can't do that. McCall, can't do what? Emily, you can't be in the car and out of the car too. That's silly, but I am. So she's experiencing seeing her body in the car, but she went out of her body. She's having trouble relating to that. Then she saw this UFO parked across the road. And she went over and there was some communication with some beings. So that's another example. So these different types of examples are there. Now, just to give another element to this thing, these white-robed beings tend to show up in these UFO accounts. Now, there's one case which is more sort of mundane sounding. Some Italian militiamen, I think they were in the reserve forces, were standing on the slopes of Mount Etna, which I believe is in Sicily, and UFO came down. Some beings got out. Some of them were tall, wearing white robes with golden hair, and others were short guys with big heads. And they just saw this. Now, supposedly they were in an ordinary state of consciousness, or at least so it would seem. These other people were in out-of-body states of consciousness. Now, in some cases, what is reported is that a person will apparently be taken physically on board a UFO, and then they'll have an out-of-body experience. Now, as an example of this person reported being physically taken onto the UFO. So she said, we're coming. Now, she was taken to this place somewhere, which she thinks actually was under the ocean. There's a whole description leading up to this point. And in this place, she said, we're coming up to this wall of glass and a huge door. It's made of glass. And the person asks, does it have hinges? And she says, no, it is so big, and I can't explain it. It is door after door after door after door. He's stopping there and telling me to stop. He says, you shall enter the door to see the one. Now you might ask, well, what the one might be? So, and I'm standing there and coming out of myself. There's two of me. It's like a twin. So she has this out-of-body experience there. She goes through the door and has what sounds like a Brahman-type experience. She says, I went in the door and it's very bright. I can't take you any further. Why? Because I can't take you past this door. Why are you so happy? It's just, I just can't tell you about it. Words cannot explain it. It's wonderful. It's for everybody. I just can't explain this. I understand that everything is one. Everything fits together. It's beautiful. So here you have a case where an out-of-body experience seems to take place after the UFO encounter, and she's taken through this door then in an out-of-body experience, and she has this Brahman-type realization. Now, I could give you a whole list of examples where this happens. So, this is the basic kind of material that you have here. So, what is going on? So, just to heighten the mystery a little bit, let's see. Okay, I have various materials. The next thing to do is to discuss what happens, discuss evidence for the physical nature of the UFOs. So, the kind of material I was just describing associates UFOs with out-of-body experiences. And you can make a whole case for this. The examples I've given could be multiplied extensively. There are people who are known to have been sleeping in their beds, and after they got up, they reported a whole UFO experience that apparently took place in an out-of-body state, and so on and so forth. So then comes the question of physical reality. So, I'll mention the physical aspect here. Let's see, let's try this TV thing. The first thing that I'm going to show, just to say what this is, there's a scientist at IBM named Marcel Vogel. He's dead now. This Marcel Vogel is the inventor of the magnetic disk coating for hard disks. So he's the man who brought the hard disk to us, for which we will all be indebted to him. So, in any case, he's a scientist who studies materials. So, some people brought a sample from a UFO for him to study. Now, there's a whole story behind this sample. It's one of the more elaborate stories, in fact, in which the person has contact with these beings from another star system. He meets them and they talk to him, and so on. So they gave him this little metal sample, and that was finally communicated to this Vogel, who looked at it with electron microscopes and all kinds of different equipment to try and figure out what it was made of. So what I'm going to show you is a little clip in which he describes his reaction to this metal sample.
Disappeared. I first accused myself of being negligent and not paying attention. And finally I just put it aside. I said, if it happens, it happens. I won't let it bother me. I don't know how to explain it. I have no way of giving any rational explanation. And at this moment, I must categorize it as a mystery.
Okay. And what is your result of
this here?
Of this material?
Right now,
yes.
I could not explain the type of material that I have and its discreteness by any known combination of materials. I could not put it together myself as a scientist. To get a combination of chromium, silver, and silicon in discrete areas. Yes, if I were to melt it together, I would see the evidence of all of it. But their discreteness is what intrigues me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because you see, if I were to take these combinations and put it into a furnace, melt it, then pour it out and pull a little ingot, I would see all of these elements present there in any one area. But I don't. I see this discrete bits of material. Now, it can only happen by some form of a cold fusion process where you have the elements present and you fuse them together so they still maintain their identity, but they interpenetrate into one another.
So in other words, do you think there is a possibility to find naturally on this earth. We can
Something like
find.
I'm going to look. I'm intrigued now. This is the type of thing I enjoy doing and dealing with, but it's also a challenge because I showed it to one of my friends who was a metallurgist, and he shook his head. He said, I don't see how it can be put together. And that's where we are right now. And I think it's important that those of us who are in the scientific world sit down and do some serious study on these things instead of putting it off as figments of people's imaginations.
That exists somewhere.
It finally was lost, but he did this whole analysis on it. So all you've got is his testimony. But he's a genuine fellow. So one can put it down to, well, there's another one. But that's Marcel Vogel. So the whole point of that little example is there you have evidence that something physically real is involved with the UFOs. This is also a whole subject, physical evidence, traces found on the ground, and so on and so forth. There are hundreds of cases of traces on the ground reportedly made by UFOs and so forth. Let's see. Now, I'll just go through these examples. The next example I'm going to show, this is a lady, this refers to another category of evidence that circulates, a lady whose husband supposedly flew alien bodies to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base back in 1947. Just to show you that people are telling stories like this, in this case about her late husband. So, try and judge the character of the lady as you see her.
There were a number of other flights out of Roswell during this period, including one piloted by Oliver Wendell Pappy Henderson.
How did he happen to tell you that he'd been involved with seeing the little bodies of the crash flying saucer?
We were at the grocery store, and we were going to check out our groceries, and there were newspapers at the stands, as there always are, and here were this newspaper, and he said, well, I guess now that they're putting in the paper, I can tell you about this. I wanted to tell you for years. He said, I want you to read this article because it's a true story. And I not only know that it's true, but I'm the pilot who flew the wreckage of the UFO to Dayton, Ohio.
You mentioned that earlier that he had seen the bodies, one of them was damaged in some way.
I think he told me that they were small, they had large heads for their size, and that the material that their suits were made of was different to anything, it was a strange kind of material.
There's a lot of material along those lines also. This is to indicate that one is dealing with something physical, because certainly if dead bodies can be produced and they lay around and can be flown in airplanes to different places, that would suggest that they're rather physical. But by the way, notice, referring back to the Krishna book, that these demonic forms produced by the Asuras sometimes were found to lay around as dead bodies after Krishna killed them, which is an interesting thought. So, let's see, what more shall I show? Oh, this one is fun. This just came recently on the news. It seems that in Mexico City, remember when there was a solar eclipse about a year ago? And it was total in Mexico City. So people were out with cameras and so on to try and photograph the eclipse, not burn out their camera in the process. It seems that it said in this, hundreds of people recorded UFOs on their video cassette recorders, an advantage of the proliferation of that technology. So I'll just show you this. It's kind of intriguing.
And for the first time, because of the home video revolution, thousands of people pointed their video cameras to the skies.
Exactly at the time of the full solar eclipse, a dish-shaped craft appears over the city, hovers for over 30 minutes. 17 people on the ground recorded it on home video. That's never happened before in the history of ufology.
When modern scientists forecasted the date of the historic solar eclipse, they weren't alone. Some believe the ancient Mayas also predicted the exact date of the eclipse more than 3,000 years ago. This Maya calendar made another startling revelation. It predicted that on the day of the eclipse, a new age of enlightenment would begin. It's referred to as the prophecy of the sixth sun.
The legend of the sixth sun, the new sun, signified by the great eclipse that just occurred, speaks of an opening of knowledge. The sixth sun indicates precisely the moment of its arrival.
Strangely, on the day of the eclipse, something did arrive in the skies over Mexico. Hundreds of those home video cameras that were shooting the eclipse got something completely unexpected. UFOs, unidentified flying objects, all videotaped by hundreds of different people. So far, more than 110 home videos have been verified as containing footage of unexplained craft.
That example just shows that these things are going on. It's curious. 110 people videotaping unusual objects over Mexico City. Of course, the images weren't too good, but the idea here is to give a concept of these things as having a physical element. What I will turn to now is some additional evidence involving physical effects produced from subtle energy, mind energy or spiritual energy. Of course, the ultimate powerful energy would be spiritual. Krishna's energy is the ultimate driving force behind everything. And that produces the different subtle energies, mind, intelligence, and false ego. And that in turn produces ether, and that transforms into different material forms that we see. So, in Drew DeKarma's lecture, there mention was made of Lourdes in France. Now, the story there is that in about, the middle of the 19th century, a French shepherd girl named Bernadotte, uneducated girl, had a vision of the Virgin Mary. That is, she saw this being who was very beautiful, glowing, floating in the air in this grotto or little cave near this town of Lourdes in France. And there were several meetings with this being. Quite a number of events occurred. But the story goes that a spring appeared there, and some people got the idea that they could be cured of various illnesses by bathing in this spring. And this began to happen. And since that day, it has in fact been happening, not very frequently, but at regular intervals. So, the interesting thing about this is the level of the medical testimony that supports this kind of phenomenon. So, there is a society of doctors who are specifically studying the cures that occur at Lourdes. And they apply very strict criteria for accepting or rejecting information. I won't read all of this, but this just gives you an idea of what they do. It says, the report of the case is then discussed critically at length under 18 headings, a vote being taken at each stage. In the first 3 stages, the committee considers the diagnosis and has to satisfy itself that a correct diagnosis has been made and proven by the production of the results of full physical examination, laboratory investigations, X-ray studies, and endoscopy and biopsy where applicable. Failure at this stage is commonly because of inadequate investigation or missing documents. At the next 2 stages, the committee must be satisfied that the disease was organic and serious without any significant degree of psychological overlay. They're very much aware that a disease could be psychosomatic. So this goes on for several paragraphs, but it gives you an idea. These are cases of reported miraculous cures. So the point is, they had to have total physical examination before and after, with all possible medical technology being applied to evaluate what happened. So, yeah?
They weren't actually investigating the lures. How they moved to the cure. They had a medical record, previous history, right?
It's after the cure has happened, then it's reported to them. And if it sounds like it's a good case, then they'll investigate it. Otherwise, they just reject it immediately. So they went through about 6,000 cases, and 64 cases met all their criteria. So this is an example of one of them. In this case, a man had a cancer that was destroying his hip bone and the upper part of the femur, including the ball and socket joint where the femur goes into the hip bone. And the cancer gradually totally destroyed the bone, so nothing was left. And the tumor was growing bigger and bigger, and the man was practically dead. He was very close to death. So he was taken to Lourdes. They dumped him in the spring, and it said, upon bathing, he had sudden sensations of heat moving through his body, which characterizes this kind of healing. We're not sure what it means, but you hear about it. When he arrived at Lourdes, he couldn't eat and had lost vast amounts of weight. This information is all included in the report. After being bathed, he felt an immediate return of his appetite and an amazing resurgence of energy. Anyway, he was in a complete body cast because his whole leg was disintegrating. It said after a month, X-rays showed that let's see, how did that work? They took him back to the hospital and nobody believed that he felt better. So he started to gain weight and to be much more active. After about a month, his doctors finally consented to take his cast off and take another X-ray. So the tumor was getting smaller and regressing. So, okay, this sometimes happens. There's spontaneous remission of cancer. It does happen. So what happened then is within 2 months, the bones in his thigh and hip had completely reconstructed themselves, and he was able to walk normally. And in 9 years since that, he's been in perfect health with no problems. It said here, this is from the report, a remarkable reconstruction of the iliac bone and cavity has taken place. X-rays made in 1964-58 never encountered a single spontaneous bone reconstruction of such a nature. So, the whole thing reconstructed. This is supposedly something that happens only in embryos growing in the womb. And then it takes 9 months. It reconstructed to the adult stage, of course, within 1 month, because the tumor disappeared after 1 month, and 1 month later the guy was walking, which means everything was back in place. So, how did that happen? Of course, we don't know how it happened. But that's one example of the idea that subtle energy can organize gross matter. I just wanted to show you another videotape. This is not a UFO tape. This shows what your body is made of. Actually, it's very useful to see this. Yeah, this is a videotape of cells, particular types of cells.
When they touch, the active ruffling membranes which cause them to move stop. The cells become passive. Another part of the cell membrane starts to ruffle and the cells move away. The significance of contact inhibition is that it demonstrates that cells, rather than migrate over one another, will migrate away from one another. In the cornea, contact inhibition of movement would stop cells migrating over one another and force them to become a monomer.
I find that interesting because you can see what those cells are like. They're just sort of globby things moving like this. Your whole body is made of that. This body is just a lump made up of those cells, and they're all like this. So, how does it work anyway? I mean, that in itself is an amazing thing. But even more amazing than that is, how can something like that be suddenly put together or taken apart. Quite remarkable. But the idea is the subtle energies can do this kind of thing. I'm now going to turn to out-of-body experiences in India. Now this is going to throw a whole new perspective on out-of-body experiences. So what do you suppose happens in India when someone has an out-of-body experience? Can anyone guess? What? He says the Yamadutas take him to Yamaraj. Now what would you think such a thing might imply? Cultural conditioning. It is a hallucination. Well, this is what happens in India. Let's see. I'll give you a case history. This is a man named Durga Jatav. We interviewed Durga Jatav, a man of approximately 50 years old, in November 1979, and again 3 months later. About 30 years before, he had been ill for several weeks, suffering from what had been diagnosed as typhoid. When his body became cold for a couple of hours, his family thought he had died. He revived, however, and later he told his family that he had been taken to another place by 10 people. He had tried to escape, but they had then cut off his legs at the knees to prevent his escape. He was taken to a place where there were tables and chairs and 40 or 50 people sitting. He recognized no one. They looked at his papers, saw that his name was not on their list, and said, "Why have you brought him here? Take him back." To this Durga had replied, "How can I go back? I don't have feet." He was then shown several pairs of legs. He recognized his own, and they were somehow reattached. He was then sent back with the instructions not to stretch his knees so that they could mend. Durga's older sister, whom we interviewed, corroborated his account of his apparent death and revival. Durga's sister and a neighbor noticed a few days after he revived that marks had appeared on his knees. There previously had been no such marks there. These folds, or deep fissures in the skin on the front of Durga's knees, were still visible in 1979. There was no bleeding or pain in the knees other than the discomfort engendered by Durga's following the instructions to keep his knees in a fixed position. X-ray photographs that we had taken in 1981 showed no abnormality beneath the surface of the skin. So here we've got a case where a person is sick with typhoid, a very serious disease. He seems to die, his body gets cold, then he revives. He tells that 10 people had taken him to where they looked at his papers and then said he was the wrong man, take him back. But this thing happened with cutting off his legs and putting them back on. Then when he revived, he recognized them. He looked through several pair. And mind you, this definitely happened out of the body, right? Because his body was laying on the bed. I mean, obviously his body was not undergoing this. But then the grooves appear in his knees. So there are many cases like this. These were collected by Ian Stevenson. He has about 16 cases like this from India. He says this is quite common. I'll give you one more example. Let's see, this was a man named Mangal Singh. In about 1978 or so, he had this experience. I was laying down in a cot when 2 people came, lifted me up and took me along. I heard a hissing sound, but I couldn't see anything. Then I came to a gate. There was grass and the ground seemed to be sloping. A man was there and he reprimanded the men who had brought me. Why have you brought the wrong person? Why have you not brought the man you were sent for? The 2 men who had brought Mongol ran away, and the senior man said, "You go back." I saw 2 pots of boiling water, although there was no fire or firewood and no fireplace. Then the man pushed me with his hand and said, "You had better hurry up and go back." When he touched me, I suddenly became aware of how hot his hand was. Then I realized why the pots were burning. The heat was coming from his hands. Suddenly I regained consciousness and I had a severe burning sensation in my left arm. So, it stated, the area developed the appearance of a boil. Mongol showed it to a doctor who applied some ointment. The area healed within 3 days but left a residual mark on the left arm, which we examined. So in this case, the person who told him to go back burned him in the out-of-body experience, and when he got back, he had the burn on his body. Well, now this is relevant to UFO cases, because there are cases where people are abducted onto UFOs, and they will say that, well, I was taken on board the UFO, and I was cut in a certain way, and then it turns out they have a scar on their body, which corresponds to the experience that they had on board the UFO. So this is often taken as evidence that they really were physically taken on board the UFO, because the scar is there to demonstrate that. But here we have out-of-body experiences in which different kinds of scars are produced, but evidently the person's body didn't go anywhere. He just had this experience. The basic conception behind all of this, then, is that you have something on the subtle platform which can generate gross effects. In the case of the UFOs, there's every indication that these are some kind of manifestation produced from a subtle platform. Various lines of evidence would tie together to indicate that. For example, they're seen to appear abruptly. Typically, when they leave a place, very often they just vanish. They just blink out, as it were. The beings associated with them do the same kind of thing. They appear and they disappear. It's as though they were practically visions or images that were generated instead of physically real things. When they fly, they don't produce sonic booms, for example, even though they greatly exceed the speed of sound. This engineer who told me about a sighting he had on a military base, namely the China Lake Naval Ordnance Testing Range here in, I believe it's in California, China Lake. He was observing a military plane coming in for a landing. This UFO was flying along beneath it, and he said in the blink of an eye it flipped up to the wing of the plane and traveled about 300 feet in just a flash like that, and then continued along. So it was though it was a non-physical thing. And yet at the same time, you have these physical effects, including just like that metal sample. Then there are the stories of the dead bodies, which are pretty much gross physical. All the wreckage found at Roswell, which is another whole discussion which I mentioned last time. Ground traces, in some cases, for example, the Valensole case that I mentioned last time, the dent in the earth looked as though many tons of pressure would be required to produce it, and a temperature of about 600 degrees centigrade was indicated. And this was investigated by French scientists who are quite reputable. And they admitted that some phenomenon, they wouldn't say what they thought it might be, but some unusual phenomenon must have done that, whatever it may have been. So you have grossly physical effects. So this corroborates in basically the Vedic conception, where we find that subtle energies produce gross material effects. And in fact, that's our basic understanding of the creation of grossly embodied living beings. The gross bodies were produced from subtle bodies by deliberate transformation, by beings on the demigod level. And this, in fact, has happened not just once, but many, many different times. One example where clearly this had to happen, although it's not explained exactly where it happened in the sequence of events, would be the case of Maharaj Ikshvaku and the dynasty that he founded, because his grandfather was the sun god, Vivaswan. So certainly the sun god has a body quite different from earthly bodies. So his son was Vivasvata Manu, and his son was Ikshvaku, but he lived on the earth as a human being, but not exactly like a human being like ourselves. because he was in he was in Treta Yuga, according to the Bhagavad Gita purport, and lived for a very long period of time and had various mystic powers. But then generation by generation, you have kings descending from him. And of course, one thing to realize is most of the descendants in these royal dynasties did not become kings, because only the eldest son could become king, and all the other children had to do other things, and they in turn would have children. So whole countries are populated by their descendants. For example, from Maharaj Yayati, the Yavanas are all descended, which should include us, most of us. So the point then is these are all descended from the sun god. So at some point, presumably going from Vivasvan to Yayati, you have the generation of gross material form from subtle material form. And in fact, what you would find is that at the stage where that takes place, the beings have the power to produce and eliminate material forms practically at will. That's shown by this example of Kardama Muni and so forth. So, I've got one more example here. What I wanted to do was give some examples from literature of Krishna consciousness similar to what I've been giving in the UFO cases. So, Satyaraj has that book about Narottam Das Thakur and Shaimananda and Srinivasacharya. So in all three of these cases, you have similar phenomena. In these cases, though, instead of going from subtle energy to gross energy, we would understand that you're going from transcendental energy through subtle to gross energy, based on the kind of examples that are occurring. In one case, Narottam Das Thakur would regularly meditate on his transcendental Leela as a gopi serving Krishna. And it's explained that in his action as a gopi, in his meditation, he'd be boiling milk for Radha and Krishna. And the milk would sometimes boil over. So he would sometimes burn his hands when he was trying to grab the pot and adjust it so that the milk wouldn't boil over. But when he came back from his meditation, his hands were burned. Now, let's just go to ordinary stigmata. Okay? Here's this classic case. A Catholic nun is meditating on the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. She's meditating on the nails driven into his hands and feet, and her hands begin to bleed, and her feet also in just the right places. And not only that, guess what? This one I really liked. I don't know if this is true, but this is what I read. This one nun, the wound that would begin bleeding on her hands was square. The Roman nails were square, not round like our nails. Somebody noted this point. But never mind that. Let's just leave that aside. The point is that when she meditated, the wound would form and bleed. Now, let's explain that in terms of the nervous system. Okay, there's the brain. Nerve cells are firing. Somehow in the brain, an image of the crucifixion is being registered in terms of a pattern of nerve impulses. Nerve impulses go streaming down the nerves. They go streaming down nerves to the arm. But what is there at the hand level for the nerves to act on that would cause that wound? There are cells, but there are nerve endings that go to the muscles. There are nerve endings that go to sense perception units, like Panchian corpuscles and other little gadgets that sense pain. Those are afferent nerves. The impulses go to the brain. Going to the hand, the nerves, well, you can dilate the little muscles in the blood vessels of the skin. That's true. That explains blushing. When you blush, you dilate the blood vessels and more blood flows and it turns red. But we've got to have the thing breaking open and bleeding in a localized area. How does it do it?
Extreme form of blushing.
Well, not only is it an extreme form of blushing, but it's localized. Localized. How does it work? I don't think the scientists have an explanation of how that works in terms of the mind. If you look at it as the brain, On the other hand, if mind is some kind of energy that can operate by transforming the ether and so forth, then it could do that. So I'm giving one broad Vedic explanation for this whole category of phenomena. Now, I deliberately started with Narottam Das Thakur because that's an easy one. All he did was come back with burn marks. Psychosomatic. Let's go to the next case. This is Srinivas Thakur. So Srinivas is meditating also. As Srinivas served the Lord in this way in his meditation, he was sitting there meditating, he could not keep his composure, and looking at the Lord's magnificent form, he began to exhibit ecstatic symptoms. This pleased Lord Chaitanya, who then took the same garland of flowers that Srinivas had given him and placed it around Srinivas's neck. Now, when it said that Srinivas gave Lord Chaitanya a garland of flowers, that means in his meditation. He was meditating on giving Lord Chaitanya a garland of flowers. So in his meditation, Lord Chaitanya took off the garland and put it on his neck. After the Lord made this loving gesture, Srinivas's meditation broke, but the garland was still adorning his own chest. Its fragrance was unlike anything he had ever experienced. So now, this is getting a little more psychosomatic. We have psychosomatic garlands. The scientist, of course, has an easy explanation for this one. It never happened. So, the one is believable because, after all, you believe such things, right? The other one is not believable, so that didn't happen. But notice the correlation between that and these other phenomena that we've been talking about. Now, the final case here was Shaimananda, who was known as Dukhi Krishnadas. And he had experiences fairly complex. The brief rundown of the story is that he was sweeping the area of of Radha and Krishna's Rasa Leela in Vrindavan, and he found this ankle bracelet or something of Radharani, so he thought it was, and he hid that. So then this old lady came to ask for it. Said, "My daughter lost that here. Did you happen to see it? You sweep here every day." And he was a bit suspicious that this wasn't an ordinary old lady, so he interrogated her to see if she really had such a daughter and, see if she really came there and so on. Finally, the lady revealed herself as Lalita, one of the principal gopis, and was extremely beautiful. And Dukhi Krishnadas gave her the bangle or whatever it was, and she marked his head with this tilak, which apparently became permanent. That then created a serious problem with his guru, who said, "Well, what is this? You're getting a new kind of tilak. You've taken a new name, namely Shaimananda." She gave him that name. And, I didn't do this. This is Guru Aparad. So he got into real trouble. And he had to convince his guru that this really happened. And his guru didn't believe a word of it. Telling me these ridiculous stories. This is some dream that you had. And we don't accept this. So finally he made this arrangement. Well, to make a long story short, the arrangement was made that I guess if the names of the Lord or something would be written on his chest, and if that could be washed away, then that would prove that he was saying something false, and if it couldn't be washed away, that would be proof that it was true. So he went into meditation and met this Lalita in his meditation this time, and she said, "Okay, you can make this proposal." And then sure enough, they weren't washed away, and finally his guru became convinced that this was genuine and so forth. That's cutting the story very much short. But anyway, the point is there you have activities apparently on this gross physical platform and on a spiritual platform involving the same personalities. So you have things switching back and forth from an apparent gross manifestation to a subtle or a spiritual manifestation. So in any case, the thing that I'm proposing in all of this is that you have a whole class of phenomena in which you can see the common themes run through them. it's a similar pattern of events that run through these different phenomena. This is true of the Vedic examples of various kinds, such as the ones I was just mentioning, and also production of the animal forms by the demons in Krishna's pastimes, production of aerial flying palaces, and so many different things. And then in the case of the UFO phenomena, you have, on the one hand, apparently very strong gross effects. In other words, physical machines appear that sometimes leave wreckage, which completely puzzle an IBM scientist, assuming that he's giving honest testimony, and I have no reason to think that he's making it up. So there are these physical effects, or wreckage littered across the field at Roswell, or whatever the case may be. But then at the same time, there are these subtle energy effects involving out-of-body experiences and so on and so forth. I'll mention one last story. I mentioned that Indian-style out-of-body experience where the fellow was burned by the man in the experience, and then when he came back to consciousness, he had an actual burn on his arm that was treated by a physician. There's a UFO case like that, in which a woman was abducted onto a UFO somewhere in New Mexico and underwent horrific experiences. And this ostensibly was completely physical. But in the course of the experiences, this big boss man came and said, she was not supposed to have been taken. You must take her back. And then he touched her head with his hand, and her head was burned because his hand was extremely hot. Then finally, after more horrendous experiences, she was finally taken back. I don't know about that. She got a severe vaginal infection as a result of other things that were done to her. People have often asked, well, what is the meaning of all this? Why are these things happening in this way? And so forth. And you can say that for all of it, including out-of-body experiences where somebody meets some glowing being and knowledge is transferred to them, and they come back and they can't remember any of it. The UFO cases always seem elusive. You know, like they fly around over Mexico City and everybody videotapes it, but then they're gone. So why didn't they, land on the White House lawn and hold a press conference and, explain everything? So things seem to work in that way, one can basically say. On these subtle energy platforms, experiences seem to take place in this way. It seems to be a basic feature. After all, look in the case of Krishna's pastimes. Why in the world take these ridiculous animal forms and go fight with Krishna? That in itself is strange. Of course, different interpretations of the meaning of those forms will be there. But you can also ask that, why didn't they just, sneak in there at night and knife him or something? Or something more prosaic like that. Or there are so many ways of killing somebody. Not that you have to run into the village as a bull with a cloud hovering over his tail and cause everyone to have, all miscarriages and all the pregnant ladies and so forth. But then again, another whole point to make is just because we do things in a particular way in the context of our culture and our abilities and powers, if you had completely different abilities and powers in a different cultural background, you might do things quite differently. And that has to be considered. To somebody else, automobiles may seem like a very strange thing. In other words, why do that? Pollute all your air and travel for hours to work at the risk of life and limb when people used to live, right next to where they worked. Why do such things? So what we do also can be pretty strange. For a basic conclusion, I've given a brief overview of some lines of evidence. And there are many other examples illustrating the same basic points. These indicate the production of gross forms of matter starting from a subtle level by intelligent beings. That would be the basic theme behind all of these examples that I'm giving. This is a basic theme in Vedic literature, and in Vedic literature it's explained how these things work in terms of subtle energies and so forth. By the way, before I forget, let me read this verse in the 11th canto, which is interesting in connection with what I've been talking about here. It is said here, the yogi who completely absorbs his mind in me, Krishna is speaking, and who then makes use of the wind that follows the mind to absorb the material body in me, obtains through the potency of meditation on me the mystic perfection by which his body immediately follows his mind wherever it goes. Now, think about that for a moment. So, there's a wind that follows the mind. Something to do with the air element. So, by manipulating that wind, if you know how to do it, you can make the body travel to wherever your mind goes. That means in practice, if I could do this, according to what Krishna is saying, in my mind, I could go to Vrindavan right now. Zip! My body would follow, just like that. And I'd be there. And I'd be gone from here. That would be pretty amazing. But that's, according to Krishna, that's one of the mystic powers that can be developed. And these are explained. So the basic idea is that in the Vedic literature, these processes by which subtle energy can produce gross energy in complex forms by the power of higher intelligence are described. In Vedic literature, there are many examples in which this happens. And we see that in these different examples, such as the ones of Shaimananda and Srinivasacharya and so on, plus in the Krishna book and throughout the Bhagavatam. Now, okay, that's Vedic literature, and someone could say, well, this is mythology. These are the stories of a religion. But in the empirical domain of things that people observe, we also see phenomena of this kind. At one end of the spectrum, you see mild phenomena, like the stigmata, or what may have happened with this lady's burn. And people will say, just mind over matter, but if you really think about it, you can't explain it in terms of the brain, the nervous system, the hormones. It really doesn't work. Then there are more extreme phenomena. It's one thing for the burn to heal up, and maybe it did have something to do with their ceremony. Then there are more extreme cases, say, where the guy's hip bone totally reconstructs. Many other examples of the varicose veins of that carpenter. 30 years of incurable varicose veins, and his leg looks like a bunch of just a mess, and then it's okay. It's put back together again. So many examples are there of this kind of thing. So that's more extreme. Then, with these UFO phenomena, you have a whole gamut of experiences that people report in which the subtle and the gross seem to practically interchange. Is it a gross experience or is it a subtle experience? It's hard to tell. Wounds or scars are produced which make you think it might be a gross experience, but then out-of-body experiences can generate similar wounds and scars. But at the same time, then you have really gross physical phenomena. Like the UFO itself is a very gross physical thing, it would appear. At least they can leave very gross physical marks and so forth. People photograph them with their Sony camcorders over, Mexico City and so on. So the basic point then is that these phenomena seen empirically corroborate the basic Vedic picture. They're similar kinds of phenomena. They seem to work in similar ways. So if you take the Vedic picture as a hypothesis, as I mentioned before, then this empirical data backs up that hypothesis, or it corroborates that hypothesis. On the other hand, none of this empirical data makes sense at all in terms of the scientific picture. And in fact, within orthodox science, these things aren't accepted at all. However, there are individual scientists who do accept these things, like this Marcel Vogel, for example. And many other scientists have studied the UFOs and so forth. Of course, as soon as you do that, then that labels you. as a person who would give credence to such kooky stuff. So this is the way the social processes work. But we do have a body of empirical data which corroborates the Vedic picture quite extensively. By the way, it fits that much better than it fits the extraterrestrial hypothesis for UFOs. That's the idea, that they're flying here from another planet and they're completely gross and physical and they just have a high technology. But these subtle energy type things corroborate the more Vedic picture of what is going on.